Hello, everybody. I am Rusty Mahalik. I'm the convener of the ACRL's Leadership Discussion Group. We are having our fall meeting, and we're very pleased and honored that Annie Bellinger joined us to discuss presentation. And I'm going to give a quick bio. Annie Bellinger is the Dean of University Libraries at Grand Valley State University. Previously, she was Associate University Librarian, Information Resources and Academic Excellence at the University of Waterloo, being an accessibility and inclusion advocate, as well as her experiences in academic, corporate, public libraries, and government settings define her career. Her research now focuses on leadership and skills development, most specifically on appreciative inquiry, inclusive hiring, and cultural development, human-centered change leadership, and strengths-based empathetic workforce development. And he is Quebecese and disabled. She received her master's in library information sciences from Western University, Canada. She is an ARL leadership fellow. Please welcome Annie Bellinger.
Thanks, everyone. Let me just share my screen and we will get moving. Okay, so today, really the focus of the topic is what if we brought the same compassion that we reserve for our users for our colleagues? And so we're going to explore today what inclusive leadership is, the traits and practices that it encompasses. And we're really centering this practice from leadership's point of view, whether it's formal or informal. So I'm not only talking about titular leadership today. And so how can we center that empathy and compassion in order to increase equity-minded practices in our libraries and foster inclusive organization? And so for our quick learning outcome, right, I wouldn't be a librarian if I didn't talk about that. And we're going to understand what inclusive leadership is. We're going to gain some awareness of traits and practices of inclusive leadership, deepen your understanding of how to center empathy and compassion in order to foster equity-minded practices. And then I'm going to look at some tools that you could use in your leadership toolkit in order to advance that. So before we dive too far in, I'd love you to use the chat and to say, what does inclusive leadership mean to you? So I'll read that out for about a minute. I'm not seeing messages come in. Listening to everyone, okay. Using a variety of styles, not having encountered that service orientation, advocating for colleagues, giving other participations, hearing leadership that empowers, being intentional, hearing and valuing ideas and opinions of others. Absolutely. Right, supporting people while meeting organizational needs and mission. So while you keep thinking about that too, here's the formal definition that the Center for Creative Leadership provides, which is that inclusive leaders are individuals who are aware of their own biases and actively seek out and consider different perspectives to inform their decision-making and collaborate more effectively with others. So for myself, just to give you a sense as to how I think about it, I use the following statement that libraries are committed to inclusive participatory leadership through ongoing development of our leaders. And as leaders, we foster a culture of care in order to have strong, engaged libraries for our campuses. And as colleagues, we work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility through the use of systems thinking, active learning, and empathy. And so anchored in the premise that inclusion is everyone's work, so that is one of my working assumptions, is that inclusion becomes everyone's work. It appears that inclusive leadership could be a core component of our journey towards inclusion as an organizational goal. And so often right now, leadership development and inclusion workshops exist as distinct entities, which leads to limited intersection of the topic. So really today I want to explore how do we start to embed inclusive leadership throughout our praxis as leaders, both formal and informal, and even our organizational cultural development. So another quick engagement, how might this concept, thinking about awareness of bias and different concepts improve our workplace and profession? And I say professions here because there are librarians, there could be archivists in the room, records managers. I know there are many subsets of our profession. Love if you have thoughts to add them in the chat, and I'll read them out loud. So having more opportunities for input from staff and leaders with a range of backgrounds and perspectives. When people feel like they're part of the process, it can help morale, absolutely. Effective leadership, reducing dysfunction and enabling more powerful work. Yeah, more impactful work because everyone feels empowered, different viewpoints leading to better decisions, people thriving because they feel valued, better systems and organizations that work for more employees and better services for users. From a public service perspective, inclusive workplace also mean our students and other stakeholders feel welcome and included, creating a sense of community, absolutely. And then some plus ones happening where everyone feels needed, their skills, experience, ideas, and their passion. So thank you. So I still created a why care, just to be safe. There are 4 main streams in my mind that make it necessary for us to be thinking about this transformation in leadership, which is, of course, what they call the new VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That diversity is not equating to inclusion. We've been doing diversity efforts in libraries for a long time, yet we're not yet at the inclusive part. Workplace expectations of what a leader is and what a leader does are actually rising and rose pretty quickly during the pandemic, but also that moral imperative towards inclusion, equity, accessibility, and belonging. And so we know that racism and inequity have existed in capitalism, and they continue to exist in ways that are often invisible to those benefiting from the system that perpetuate it. And so there's many aspects of the world that have been changing, and that landscape means we need to be changing as well. And so we know from research reports that there is power in diversity and inclusion, but we also are learning that diversity is only powerful when it's facilitated well, when someone can help the group reap the benefits of that divergence in order to lead to convergence and shared understanding and new knowledge together. And so we need the ability to draw out unique perspectives and contributions from our team and to build on differences effectively, because differences in and of themselves can actually lead to more conflict. And so how do we actually harness that into healthy and productive conflict rather than dysfunction? And so a recent report showed that only 31% of employees believe that their leaders are inclusive. So that means that less than a third of people think that their leaders see, value, or respect them as a whole person. So when we think about the Great Resignation, to me, that's sounding alarm bells. And we know that when people are being treated fairly, their uniqueness is appreciated. They have a sense of belonging, a voice in decision making. They feel more included. So the Deloitte Insights report has a lot of recent research on those topics. And so in a nutshell, Deloitte found that inclusive leadership was about treating people and groups fairly, but it means based on unique characteristics, not stereotypes. It also means equal and equity are actually different concepts, and we need to be thinking about that. And personalizing to individuals, so we need to understand value uniqueness and accept them, and then leverage the thinking of diverse groups to lead to better decision making and reduce the risk of being blindsided. And so therefore, the 3 elements of inclusion become fairness and respect, being underpinned by the idea that equality of treatment and opportunity is actually should be becoming the equity of opportunity, right? So many of you have probably seen the baseball game picture with 3 kiddos. One is very tall, one is very short, and they each get 1 box. The tall one is now taller, and the short one still can't see. And in fact, when we think about justice, there should be no fence in that particular image. So value and belonging, so feeling that we are appreciated and connected, and then confidence and inspiration. So how do we have the confidence to speak up and the motivation to do so, and the safety? So psychological safety becomes really, really important in this topic. So Deloitte also did another report where they interviewed over 1,000 leaders. Now, this is based in corporate culture, but there's a lot of analogies that can be drawn. And so they found 6 traits that these inclusive leaders had. The first one was commitment. And so they were committed to diversity and inclusion because they had personal values that aligned with that. They had a sense of fairness and they believed in it. So they were willing to take personal risk to advance. So that's the moral imperative approach to it. They had the courage to speak up and challenge the status quo, but they were also had the courage to be humble about their strengths and weaknesses. So how do you learn? It's really about the challenge of imperfection. We're all on a journey here. And as someone who is disabled, I know quite a bit about the disability community and have been growing in other areas and have to acknowledge that there are areas even within disability that I'm going to be learning because I don't have that lived experience. The third trait was the cognizance of bias. So they're aware not only of their personal bias, but organizational blind spots and can self-regulate to work against that. So self-awareness. So here we're really talking about having a high level of emotional intelligence in order to be able to move forward through that. Curiosity. So they had an open mindset, a desire to understand how others view and experience the world, but also a high tolerance for ambiguity. Right? So the work of inclusion is not clear-cut. And so how we weave that into our daily practices is going to be an experimentation. The fifth trait was cultural intelligence. So they were confident and effective in cross-cultural interaction. That curiosity led them to value cultural differences rather than considering about ethnocentric approaches of what is inferior or what is a better culture. So they really worked against that. And they also manage, because of that tolerance of ambiguity, manage the stress of engaging with a new cultural environment where they are themselves learning. And the last trait was collaboration, or being collaborative by empowering others and creating and leveraging the thinking of it. So in many ways, they're facilitators, they're activators, and they're willing to to hold voice in order to advance that collaboration. So in my opinion, I feel that, so we've talked about feeling seen, heard, valued, and you put that in the chat. It's really critical to fostering that inclusion and belonging and ultimately high functioning organization. But if you believe their leaders value them, how do we fix that? And so by shifting to an inclusive leadership style, whether informal or formal leader, we can set the tone and start to model the behaviors for teams to create an environment where people do feel seen, valued, respected. They're able to contribute. So in short, they are feeling that they belong. And so in my judgment and experience, the characteristic that the literature points out that also pan out in terms of active, regardless of your preferred leadership style, is someone who brings a level of humility. Now, I would call this almost confident humility, right? They are confident in what they know, but they're humble enough to learn from others at any given time. They're empathetic, and here I mean cognitive empathy, so that they are seeking to understand and validate the experiences they may never have had in order to find shared understanding, which is different than that sympathy or emotional empathy, where when someone is sad, I'm sad with you, it's really trying to understand cognitively where is someone coming from. They hold an ethic of care in their approach, seeking to not only mitigate harm, but promote good by holding that their actions need to center on personal relationship, on care, and almost like that benevolence. Like how do I find a place and leave it better each time? You know, how do I add value? And so in many ways, they're decentering their own ego, and they have a strong sense of self and their value so that they can hold to their core and act with integrity over and over in difficult situations. They have the courage to speak up and speak out, right? So Maya Angelou said that courage was the most important of all virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. So to enact that, there are 6, and there's a clarity of purpose. They know why they're there and what they're seeking to do. And so they're going to invest in relationship building. They're going to invest in recognition to help support growth in others. They're going to foster inclusive spaces with appreciation, social connection to encourage colleagues to recognize each other as humans first, and create opportunities to engage each other. And then we're going to encourage participation by using a variety of means and venues to gather input and feedback. So inclusion is an invitation that's extended day after day. and alignment. They're going to share a vision of what could be, what is important and why, and help colleagues see how they contribute to the larger whole. So really building on what you've shared in the chat earlier. So let's talk a little bit about how inclusive leadership can be intertwined with other leadership theories, such as transformational leadership, servant, participatory, authentic. Inclusive leadership is really about centering equity, compassion, and clarity within your existing style. So here I'm not proposing you're changing, it's about layering human-centered approaches within it. And so the Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. It's really about starting where you're at and finding micro practices to help center the humanities of others. So we'll start with kind of how do we start that intertwining, and then I'll move into some concrete tools that I have found helpful in my praxis. So first, it's building trust through communication. So inclusive leaders are highly communicative. And so you can communicate at all times by, as you think about communicating, demonstrate your values, model behaviors and actions in your messages and approach. So really be anchored in what the work is and how you do that. If you have guiding principles or values and actions, each organization will call these a little bit different. Put them into action. Articulate how you're using those in making decisions, in prioritizing work, in advancing projects. So really bring them back to the front. They're not a pretty poster in a boardroom, but they're really meant to be guiding us through our work and impact our decisions and approaches so we can continue to articulate that. You know, I've seen instructional design librarians do this beautifully with how they're embedding universal design of learning throughout their work. And so it really can be very powerful. Always thinking about what is the core messaging that I'm trying to bring and reinforcing it in all messages to help others what is, in fact, also stable and remains important to us, right? There's a lot of change all around us in every one of our organizations. So the more we can show some stability, humans need that, right? That's the instinct of safety. Creating and sustaining positive relationships is going to be really important so that you actually have rapport and trust, but also feedback loops. So we talk a lot about feedback loops and change management, but it's really ongoing. If change is now the constant of our work, that means change management needs to become sort of a constant. So when we ask for information, sharing back how we've used it or not used it, how it's impacting our approaches or design, that's really important. So we'll dig a little more into feedback loops later. And so much of traditional management practice, and I'm thinking particularly pre-leadership movement, is about mitigating risks. And so what if management could in fact promote good? And so by layering human-centered approaches, we can start to promote good by centering the human experience, empowering others, engaging colleagues as partners. And that can extend all the way to our student colleagues who often are the face of the library, provide opportunities to plan and take action collectively, articulate why, what, and how. So in each of our organization, we have folks who really need to know how this aligns to mission. Why am I doing this? We have folks who desperately need to know what. The why is less important. And the most patient folks actually are the how people. This is all great. How is this exactly impacting me? So thinking, how do we articulate all three of those as we look to our work ahead? And then here's my pie in the sky dream that we seek to co-create as our ideal. Now, we don't co-create an emergency escape plan in the middle of a fire. I'm not saying that. But when we have bandwidth and the time, let's seek to really have a lot of voice throughout the organization, and that the people who are most impacted have the most power. So I'm talking about shifting the power dynamics within an organization. Now, all of that's going to require that we bring into intentionality and reflections to all of the processes we're using, the formal and informal channels that we're fostering, and how we support one another. And so we can do that by growing our emotional intelligence. So Maya Angelou said that, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And so emotional intelligence, which was popularized by psychologist Daniel Goleman, is defined as our capacity to be aware of, to control, and to express emotions. Now, in a post-traumatic world after COVID and the George Floyd murder and continued racialized violence and gun violence in the US, the reality that many of our colleagues are living with trauma is there. And so by having our emotional intelligence, it can help us to handle interpersonal relationship more judiciously and empathetically. So there are 4 key spheres of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, which is myself. Do I know my emotions, my strengths, my weaknesses, my impact on others? Self-management. Am I controlling my positive and negative emotions, my impulses, and am I being adaptive to the situations at hand? Social awareness, that ability to have empathy for others, navigate politically, and network proactively. And this becomes really important as we leave the library. But also relationship management. Are we able to inspire through persuasion, motivation, building bonds, and disarming conflict? And so some of the tips for growing that, there are 4 key tips in the literature, which is 1, to listen closely and withhold judgment. That second one is often the harder part. So we can leverage empathetic listening, and I'll dig into that in the next slide. We can connect with colleagues on a personal level, so we can show care for them as individual, building trust. This is about the whole person. This is also, though, where we get into boundaries. What boundaries are we defining? We want to unlock motivation to understand what matters most to people, what drives them, and how they like to be recognized. In my culture, we use food a lot as a way to recognize and thank people. Not everyone's going to appreciate that. So I need to be aware of who will appreciate food, who actually wants a personalized note, and who might want more public recognition. We want to seek to understand more about others and ourselves. So learn how our identities impact our work, how relationships are formed, what are emotional triggers and areas of growth. And that's where the trauma-informed can become a helpful practice. So in fact, the Center for Creative Leadership says leadership effectiveness is constrained or amplified by how well leaders understand themselves, their awareness of others, and how they navigate the resulting interaction. I would say that applies to every one of our colleagues as we navigate culture together that we are creating it. So empathetic listening and communication. Empathetic listening is active listening, but it adds multiple levels. So the Tao Te Ching states that our conversations help create our world. Speak of delight, not dissatisfaction. Speak of hope, not despair. Let your words bind up wounds, not cause them. So it's really an invitation to consider, how do we speak to one another? Tone, word choice. And so hyperboles, we know, can exacerbate issues, but can invalidate our previous part of our statement. Now, I'm not arguing that we should be toxically positive and ignore problems and concern. I'm just encouraging an abundance mindset or a solution mindset where we're really thinking about how real communications occur when we listen with understanding, which Carl Rogers spoke after surviving concentration camps. So listening with empathy allows us to create connections and new understanding. And so it's really about a mindset and a philosophy to build trust and respect, enable and release emotion, reduce tension, encourage at the surfacing of information, create an environment that's conducive to collaborative problem solving. And so we can prepare ourselves by putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. That's the hard part, right? We're not actually saying you're going to have that lived experience, but try to suspend your disbelief and understand that that reality is real for them. And so you can do that by validation without agreement necessarily. You want to articulate how your values fit into this communication, anchor yourself in your purpose, whether it's the purpose in that conversation or in what you bring to your role. Focus on short and long-term relationship, right? So as we approach difficult situation, to really focus on maintaining the health of the relationship, the self-esteem of others, and showing compassion. And so we can think about the 5 C's, which actually come from crisis communication: clarity, consistency, addressing concerns, care, and confident humility in our communication. And so those can be really helpful. As you think about a hard communication, have I addressed all of those? Am I clear? Is my message consistent over these difficult conversations? Am I addressing their concern? Am I showing care for their concerns? But am I also showing confident humility in how I'm approaching a solution to their concerns or co-creating it? I also would advocate that we leverage participatory approaches because they can, participation increases empowerment, which reduces helplessness and therefore leads to action. And so participatory leadership really is a set of organizational values and leadership behaviors that leads to others being engaged. And so it can help bridge the typical chasm that exists between leaders and managers and colleagues and therefore have a more adaptive, resourceful, resilient behavior. And so we do this by, there are many benefits. We can provide clarity of how decisions will be made, define how and when input will occur for colleagues, create a sense of ownership and agency. We also can provide a wider view of the organization, and then make transitions and change easier by being clear about what each person owns and how they can actually be part of creating solutions rather than having change done to them. You know, if you self-reflect, change that you're initiating, you're often very excited for. Change that's happening to you is often this place of resistance or fear or uncertainty. This is new knowledge for me, but with more human-centered and inclusive behavior, the shadow of that, right? Every strength has a shadow. And so the risk is to not provide clarity of decision-making and accountability. So if we're diffusing power and we're empowering others, the easiest thing is to say, well, we've empowered. Well, empowered for what? Decisions, and when, and under what criteria. And that requires a new level of intention. And so here we can create clarity by having decision-making frameworks to spell out decision-making roles and responsibilities, can help us think through specific decision processes in advance, identify who should be involved in what role they should play so that people know exactly what they're accountable for in much clearer ways. It can also provide a way to create a key decision inventory. So if there are big decisions that happen regularly, actually letting people know exactly that. And so some of the questions that a decision-making framework would help you answer is which decisions are most important, who is deciding it, what are they deciding, who is doing the work, who is impacted, how is consultation happening, and when and how will people be informed. So every change is different, and so every decision can be different, but it's beneficial to define responsibility and accountabilities. Now, of course, by clarifying who's accountable, you can reduce that uncertainty, and defining how and when consultation and information will occur, you can reduce anxiety. And by stating the sought after outcome, you can strengthen buy-in and uphold the scale of change of decision-making. This has been a lived lesson as I've brought more human-centered approaches, is to say, actually, I haven't been clear exactly where my own power lies at all times. And so we can think about decision rights in two ways. There are decision rights and improvement rights. So decision rights sound exactly like what it is. They're both explicit and implicit, but who makes the decisions? What decision are they making, and what, who's committing resources? That's really who the decision maker. And it can happen at different levels. Forgiving a fine, that's a decision point at the desk, whereas whether or not we have fine might be at the director of operations level, and how, if you are collecting fines, how fines money is spent might be at the director level. And so their decision rights can be distinct from your organizational structure, but they are, in fact, quite important to define. And improvement rights actually is the organization's engagement with those that do not hold decision-making, but have a role in shaping the decision. So these should be awarded broadly. We think in our libraries of improvement rights in three ways. Input, early in the process, having lots of space to shape the recommendation. Feedback, further in the process, giving thoughts that may or may not be used. And implement the decision with flexibility in the how and space to ask clarifying questions. So those are the three level. Now, when we do delegate decision-making, if in fact we have reserved a right to veto, then we in fact own the decision. So rather we should delegate it and establish what criteria that a decision should be escalated again. So before we dive right into tools, just quickly in the chat, do you think, what might be problematic about the concept of inclusive leadership in your organization or our professions? People with bad ideas holding back progress, right? Yeah, so articulating how you're going to filter ideas, people misunderstanding how much impact they'll have on decision. Absolutely. Yep. So improvement versus decision rights. A loss of controls to those that have more traditional authoritative view of leadership. Absolutely. Yeah, it is a mind shift. Anxiety of current false scarcity model. Some people don't want to participate in decision making because they see as being asked to do more. Absolutely, yeah. People who've experienced non-inclusive leadership are going to be reluctant to engage or trust change. Resistors can be a challenge, but also acting inclusive and then not being earnest. Yeah. Yeah, performative inclusion can be incredibly harmful. So we'll dive quickly into some tools that I've used for inclusive leadership. You will likely have other tools, so I'll love to hear more about those. Feedback loops, which I want to credit Megan Musoff from really introducing me. Though I was using them, I don't know that I was conscious about how I was using them, to be fair. So it's really about designing feedback loops as part of our overarching communication strategy. And so they create an opportunity to gather input from our colleagues, information about any particular topic, providing them an opportunity to influence the change we're trying, but then closing the loop by sharing what we learned, right? So we've probably all experienced what I call checkmark consultation. Like, yeah, we sent out a form. Doesn't feel like we changed anything, but we consulted people. And so by closing the loop, by telling people what you've done, it can create really more engaged leadership and can start to disarm that distrust that this isn't actually a real change in approach. And then it demonstrates your organizational values in action. So sometimes I've actually done it with associate dean job description, where people, I did town halls and I said, this town hall, this comment was made, here's how I used it or why I didn't use it. So being almost like point by point answering the feedback. It is a time commitment, but it's had a pretty significant impact when we do it. A tool that I find quite helpful is appreciative inquiry, which is the co-evolutionary search for what the best in people, their organization, and the relevant world around them. It's a very hopeful place to be in appreciative inquiry. But it is a change management tool that is different by focusing on what is best and what the ideal outcome is rather than problem solving. So you start with what is ideal, and then you figure out where you are, and then you create an aspirational change map. And so it can ask people to explore strengths and successes that already exist by asking questions that strengthen the capacity to apprehend, anticipate, heighten positive potential, asking the questions in a positive frame, seeking the strength as opposed to the problem. And so it's really centered in three concepts of appreciation by recognizing what is best, inquiry by asking questions and believing that the very act of asking a question sets a change in motion, and then wholeness that encourages participation from all, knowing that the best ideas often emerge from unexpected places. So it's really a whole system process that's anchored in design thinking and systems thinking. And so two specific tools, because appreciative inquiry is a very significant body of work, but there are two tools that I found particularly helpful. One is called Generative Questions, and it's about using open-ended questions to allow speakers to imagine what could be and explore what is. And it's about generating conversation and dialogue rather than discussion, which I see as equating sometimes with concussion. And so we're going to be asking why, how, and what questions as powerful rather than who, when, where, which questions. I do want to say one caveat: why questions can be a trigger for some who feel that it's a judgmental. So I often rephrase why questions as how might we or help me understand. And then it's going to be the scope of question. So you need to think about what is your positive intent of the overall inquiry. So you could be using multiple questions to facilitate a conversation. And you want to know, instead of, for example, what can be done from preventing this again, is a better question than why did we fail? Right? Well, the first one stimulates reflective thinking. The second one is looking to assign blame. And so, of course, as we do this, we can think about moving to generative. Does our decision lack perspective? Yes or no? What would someone who has very different set of beliefs say about our decision? Now, as you go forward with this, think about what assumptions or beliefs are you introducing with your question? How would you approach the issue if you had an entirely different belief system? And is this a question to which we do not know the answer? If you already know the answer or have a preset right response, it's no longer inquiry. Another tool that's been really helpful in cultural change is the name it, flip it, frame it. And so in Name It, you actually have people can work through this worksheet. Name the problem. It's often a negative statement. Why have we failed? We want them to flip it. What is its opposite success statement? We want to succeed. And then frame it in reality. So that becomes your generative questions that can drive the conversation. Like, what could success look like? What did go well? How do we build on that? What would we like more of? How should we try? Like, how would we feel safe to try again? So this is a psychological technique called cognitive reframing, which consists of identifying and then changing the way situations, experience, events, or ideas or emotions are being viewed. And so we want to refashion negative thoughts to positive one in order to open up our imagination, not to ignore problems. Now, framing what is good cannot be done by invalidating the realities of others involved in the change. So this isn't the place that you start if you're in active dysfunction. This is the place when you're in that kind of murky middle where there are concerns, but there is a level of trust. Liberating structures. So I'm a big believer in using facilitations as I prepare for dialogue, whether it's my leadership team, all staff, my dean colleagues. And so the creators of liberating structure want everyone to learn to foster big changes by inviting people to make small structural change in how they work. And so there are facilitation tools that are meant to be easy to learn, microstructures that build relationships and trust. They foster lively participation. They make it possible to truly include and unleash everyone, be disruptive innovators, and can replace more controlling and constraining approaches. So they're really meant to open up our discussion. And they have 99 different tools that you can customize for yourself. And one of them is Triz, which is called Fun Destruction, where you ask, what is the worst we could possibly be? And then what are we doing? Like, what would it look like if we were that? And what are we currently doing that we need to stop doing because it might be that? And I've in fact used that with our President's Council to much hard truths and laughter. Another quick tool, earlier I talked about the importance of clear decision-making and boundaries as human-centered approaches are embedded in your leadership practice. There are many models. There's RACI, DASI. I recommend the RAPID model as a place to start because it comes from nonprofit and it's often easier to translate to library culture, whereas the RACI model is particularly helpful in project management. RACI is RACI. So the RAPID model gives us a way to assign roles in decision process by clarifying who provides input into a decision, who shapes a decision, and ultimately who decides it, and then who carries out the decision once it's made. And so there are two important caveats. RAPID's an acronym. It doesn't specify the order in which they have to be done. And though RAPID implies speed is paramount, it's not. It's intentionality that is paramount in order to create clarity and accountability. And so if we think back about decision rights versus improvement rights, in this model, recommend is the first stage of decision rights because you filter and finalize the recommendation. You often decide to recommend or not. And decide is where you're owning the final decision. And for improvement rights in this model, there are three types of improvement rights. There's agreement, where people provide information input that must be considered within the bounds of someone's expertise. It's about getting the best approach. And then there's performance, which is people are accountable for implementing it. They should be empowered to develop the how within certain boundaries. And then input is people who are consulted to fine tune the recommendation by helping to find improvements and missed opportunity. An equity lens is another tool that I would recommend you consider. It's I consider a critical tool to support a focus on equity, accessibility, inclusion. It's a set of questions that help you see from a new perspective, hold on to your values, increase participation by those holding non-dominant identities, and that's based on your culture. And so the Center for Nonprofit Advancement describes the purpose of an equity lens to be deliberately inclusive as an organization makes decisions. Introduces a set of questions to help decision maker focus on equity in their process and outcomes. So I've put on this slide some standard questions in an equity lens. So what decision is being made? Who is at the table? How is the decision being made? What assumptions are the foundation? Can we be explicit in naming these assumptions, the values, and the cultural biases for them? Sorry, I see a typo, I'll fix that when I upload it. And what is the likely impact, and what is ultimately our decision? And so they can be modified and adapted for your own organization for different processes. There are equity lenses for hiring, for research, for public engagement. So there's many, many ways to use an equity lens. And then the Last tool I'm going to share is about collective engagement agreement. So in order for us to do anything with each other, we first have to understand how we want to be with each other. And so having stated and understood rules of engagement, shared agreements for participation helps to create a brave space for individual participation. So defining norms for conversation, community, organization can help people understand this is who we are and how we do things. So Margaret Wheatley said, to create a learning organization, we must understand the underlying agreements we've made about how we will be together. And so by creating collective engagement agreements, which are also called rules of engagement, then we can define how we operate best. And they're best if the group generates them together. The group should identify how they will be applied and when and how the group's alignment will be evaluated. In order to also define what are our communication norms, what is in and out of bounds, and if something's out of bounds, how are we calling each other in? So how are we holding each other accountable together? We're going to create shared understanding about how we are as a team, and then we should reference them often to center the group. So often, even at the start of every meeting, we might refer back to those, and at the end of a meeting, particularly if it's a longer meeting, we could say, how did we do? Let's self-evaluate on these ones. Now, sometimes people see no need for this exercise, particularly if they hold a lot of privilege. So I often start, when I'm creating them, a discussion of the following question. When you've been part of a group that really produced some amazing results, what helped make that possible? And then people will suggest some clarity of roles and responsibilities, some shared goals, or understanding how to work with each other. That makes it easier for me to then ask the next question. Given the work we're to do with each other, what are some of the agreements or ground rules we should make to guide our efforts together? And so I put an example on the slide of some that I've used in divergence thinking. Just past patterns need not define future patterns. We're empowered in our process. We're working towards the formation of shared understandings. We ask clarifying questions before assuming intent, and each takes care of comfort needs. And so we have 15 minutes left. So your turn. What questions, what thoughts do you have? The slides, including all the references and other resources, will be loaded on scholarworks.gvsu.edu/library_presentations. So I'm going to stop, and that's my Twitter handle, my email. So I welcome questions even after the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and then look to the questions that you might have. Questions, thoughts, things that resonate, things that you think I'm out to lunch with? I welcome them all. What types of boundaries have you given to help people in the implementation phases? So I'm presuming of change, implementation phases of change. So often I have a background in project management and information architecture. That's how I came to be a librarian. And so I will use the scope note and project charters as a way to help define boundaries of roles. So what are the roles and responsibility within the scope of a change effort? Who has decision-making power? I know at my library, I brought the concept of executive sponsorship. So every project should have a sponsor, so someone who can help move obstacles, make decisions, liaise with administration as needed. So also articulating what is out of scope has been helpful in the implementation changes. As I've said, currently I have learned so I'm 5.5 years as the dean, and I've learned that in bringing human-centered, I need to reset some boundaries. During the pandemic, we went very human-centered. Even I started serving on the desk to make sure that I wasn't asking others to do what I wasn't willing to do. But now I have managers who feel they can't say no to anything anymore. So we're needing to reset our equilibrium to say, we want to be human-centered in achieving our work. It's not human-centered at the cost of achieving our work. So that will be another boundary that we are working to set right now, but also defining what level of decision-making has to happen based on our organizational culture and the greater university context. I'd love to hear if you have any insights as well, or like aha moments and takeaways for you. So as inclusive leadership practices involve investing time in order to be intentional, how do you work with others who want decisions to be made very quickly? So this is a question in many ways about decentering white supremacy cultures in libraries. Like, what is in fact truly urgent and what criteria will we use? So there are times where we don't have the liberty. And so how do we center our values? How do we articulate our values? So I think about it in different frames, right? So if my ideal is co-create, I don't always have time to co-create. Give you an example. Last week, our provost gave us 1 week to turn around and give a staffing plan. Co-creation would have been great at that point, but it's not feasible. So I made sure, okay, who has to have say in the staffing plan? For sure, my department heads need to have the ability to say what are their greatest pain points. And then I need to have criteria for how I'm making my decision and then share that back out. So I looked at what has the greatest impact to our core work. How is this advancing our strategic alignment? And is this fitting with our commitment to care for our faculty and staff? So trying to think about criteria ahead of time allows you to make those decisions faster. Now, I also, at times, I realize I hold a lot of titular power in my organization, but I'll ask to people like, what information? So I use the ladder of inference. That should have been another tool I could have put in the slides, but the ladder of inference to ask questions of, particularly of leaders, like, why is this in fact urgent? And so if it's not urgent, then how do we make space for others? Or who must have voice? So I think of it almost like the gobstopper. If the ideal is being at the outer layer, the reality is sometimes we have to do maybe the central layer or the next layer so that we consult with those. So some of it is about having conversation. Why is this important? And thinking about the stakes. So sometimes that urgency will undermine the effort that we're trying to do. And then there are other times we just need to get it done, right? So it's really about having those conversations early and often, and creating a leadership mindset within an organization where we value voices. Part of how I've also done that, and I do hold the power, so I want to acknowledge that, I wrote into their job descriptions and I wrote into their reviews. Right? If you want change, set the expectation, give the tools, and then create the accountability measures. Okay, so in a lot of conversations, we noticed getting new staff and staff further down the reporting line engaged can be a challenge, building on that sense of safety that takes work to build trust. Absolutely. And so thinking about when and how do you build community, even tools like a check-in at the start of a meeting when you're in a small group, right? Like, where are people's mood at? Or they can be silly questions like, you know, what's your favorite pie flavor? Or what are you most looking forward to fall? Or what's been an unexpected amount of joy? So making a little bit, even like a 5-minute transition that acknowledges our humanity. So what ways are there to begin introducing this culture in small ways to bring folks along and build trust? So I just mentioned that the check-in, so within the scope that you have, so I use the check-in with leaders, I use that with peers. That's been one way. I also like to articulate in many of my communications, which strategic alignment am I doing, or which value am I living at this moment? Because, you know, organizational values are not flatly prioritized. When I think about space, inclusion becomes far more important than perhaps partnered expertise might become, or collaboration. So really thinking about, in this instance, what is the hierarchy of the values, and can I articulate that to others? So how do I model that? I found what I've seen in my organization is folks using that name it, flip it, or generative questions with peer-to-peer to introduce this concept gently, especially when a conversation is getting heated or they're stuck. Someone will hear kind of what is the thread that the person is bringing that they're not articulating or feeling frustrated about, and how do I flip that to a how might we question? Right. So, you know, how might we have voice in this decision could be a simple way of doing that. And so really thinking about what are the micro practices in your area that you could try. So I would invite you today, if you have a Post-it, like think about of the tools I've introduced or another tool that would fit this concept. What is one small thing that you could try in the next 2 weeks? And then use a learning loop, right? What did I try? What went well? Where did I struggle? What did I learn? And what will I try next? And so modeling is going to be the most important way to start to introduce this culture change in small ways. What might be one? I mean, I'm happy to keep answering questions. I also love to hear, what is one thing that you might try in the next couple of weeks. Do you have a template that you use for your decision framework? What does it look like for different initiatives? So for big projects, we actually use the RACI chart, and there's some great introduction. I think in the slides, I might actually have a RACI chart introduction. Don't see it, but so that would be one thing that I do for large projects, like who's going to be responsible, who's going to be accountable, consulted, and informed. We've used that for our ILS migration recently. That worked really well. We're currently building a decision-making framework that's localized for the library. So when it's ready, we're going to share it on our ScholarWorks under library reports. And we're calling it RIFD. It's not a great acronym, but it's going to be recommender, input, decider, feedback, decider, implement, because we use the language of input, feedback, and implement. So we want to clarify what is decision right, what is improvement rights, while honoring our existing culture. And that's where appreciative inquiry can be really helpful too, is to honor what is good and what is the core as you change to reduce that anxiety. Someone earlier said change can be traumatic. It absolutely can. And so let's figure out what is most important to us in our work and honor that throughout any change efforts that we have and any cultural change. How do you organize and share decision document? So we use an intranet for our decisions. So we did a programmatic review. You can find the guide on the library reports on ScholarWorks, that we actually did an input cycle, a feedback cycle, and then an implementation that articulates our values, how we're going to live them, our decision-making principle, the process, the templates. But the actual decisions are all on our intranet, and we're currently writing a summary report. And even our leadership team has a charter for how are we together, how do we make decisions, how do we share decisions, how do we communicate. So we are trying to make the implicit explicit so that it's more transparent and visible without having an over reliance on documentation, right? Because documenting to silence can be a marker of white supremacy culture. Here, it's really about communicating to open up what looks like the Wizard of Oz curtain, right? So even, for example, annual reviews, we've documented everything all the way to how I go about setting salary, because that's in my duties at my organization. So what criteria do I use? Do I take market and compression into account before merit, and then all of those things. So yeah, it is about making explicit the implicit. Yeah, happy to. I know folks have to transition to a 2 o'clock. So if you have other questions, feel free to reach out either on Twitter or to my email. Always happy to talk about this topic.
Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Annie, for this great presentation. I do miss our being able to clap, but this was a wonderful presentation, and hope you all enjoyed your lunch and learn. And I hope to see you next spring. We have a couple of great presentations for the ACRL Leadership Discussion Group coming up. Have a great day, everybody.